Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Comparative Constitutional Law Research Forum CCTL seminar on managing legitimacy and stability in multi-level governance. We are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Maja Sahadžić. Let me give a quick introduction before handing over to her. So Dr. Sahadžić is an assistant professor at the Utrecht University School of Law in the Netherlands. She's also part of their Institute of Constitutional Administrative Law and Legal Theory. She serves as visiting professor at the University of Antwerp, senior research fellow at the Law Institute in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I'm pleased to say, as an affiliated scholar with us at CCTL at CUHK LAW. Maja is also, along with me, the co-chair of the Committee on New Directions in Scholarship of ICON-S, which is the largest learned society on public law. Before joining Utrecht, she was assistant professor and postdoc at the University of Antwerp. She's also held positions in Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, and the United States. Her research revolves around multi-level governance, dynamic legitimacy, dynamic stability, asymmetries, constitutional values and principles, fundamental rights, authoritarianism, alternative conflict solutions, and constitutionalism under extreme measures. So Maja is going to speak for about 40 minutes. We should then have about 15 minutes or so for questions. If members of the audience, if you have questions, please send them to me, Rehana Biratna, in the chat. And I will select some of those questions to ask Maja at the end. So with that said, Maja, over to you. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First, I'm going to share my screen if I still know how to do it, because it seems that the pandemic has ended long ago. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I imagined this seminar for today. Well, it's not going to be the book presentation itself. Well, the content is definitely important. I think the content I will discuss at the very end in more details, also along the way. But I also thought that the process in terms of methodological choices was also very interesting. Especially as a legal scholar, and as legal scholars, we do not necessarily use empirical approach that often, or ever at all. So that was actually the reasoning for such maybe not entirely expected type of a presentation that you're going to see or hear today. So I'm going to start with the process, and along the way explain how I actually got to the content. And at the very end, I'm going to tell you a little bit about legitimacy and stability as well. And I'm going to refer to the research that also my colleague Jason Buhai has done on the Chinese country study. Just as an example, because I think it's maybe interesting for you, but also for me in terms of feedback, just as a checks and balances type of a thing. How I got to the point of writing this particular book. Well, the thing is that if there's something I remember from my childhood, those are the pictures of IRA and ETA. In Northern Ireland, but also in Spain, and terrorist activities that they pursued in order to gain political autonomy for Northern Ireland and the Basque Country. Of course, in the meantime, ceasefire has been signed, and the agreements between the Northern Ireland and the UK government has been signed. The ETA halted all of the activities a little bit later, of course, than the 1997 when the IRA stopped the activities. But of course, another thing appeared in Spain, and that is Catalonia. So what we saw was actually the devolution in the UK and regionalization in Spain. So about extreme examples, another very extreme example is of course Bosnia and Herzegovina. And here you see the picture of the Sniper Alley in Sarajevo, which perfectly depicts the conflict between three different ethnicities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which also resulted in territorial reshuffling based on identity differences in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then that is, of course, a very personal example because I come from the Balkans, so that was very close to home. And then I moved to Belgium. And then normally people assume that Belgium is the land of Poirot, which is Agatha Christie's character. And Poirot, of course, he speaks French, and everyone assumes that all of the Belgians speak French. And then if I mentioned that I actually, when I was learning to speak Dutch, when I would mention that, everyone would assume that I actually lived in the Netherlands. And Antwerp is also where I live now. Antwerp is very close to the Netherlands. But not many people actually know that, that Belgium went through numerous state reforms in order to accommodate identity differences. And these were as well territorially embedded. So how Belgium actually looks today is, this is how I see it as a scholar in multi-level governance or federal scholar. But going even further, maybe another example would be Italy. That is something that I got interested along the way because Italy is known as a country of pizza, pasta, and maybe wine, so tricolore. But Italy is also the place where specific minorities, German language minorities, but also French speaking minorities live, and they have their specific regions with specific rights and so on. So it is a very specific case of regionalization as well. And of course, somehow along the way, I stumbled upon China as well, because if I asked my students, and I had a class maybe 2 weeks ago, and I asked them, would you call China a unitary or a federal state or anything in between? The answer was unanimously unitary. And then we discussed a little bit about EMARs and SARs in China. And then we realized it wasn't that black and white. But my primarily question, having all of this in mind, and of course, personal interest, was whether there is any connection between all of these. And to me, it seemed that identity differences actually bring specific intermediary levels of government between the local level and of course, the central level or the state level. And because of that, also some subnational entities or sub-state entities, whichever makes you less anxious or more comfortable, then they get a differentiated positioning within the system because they're different. And so I was thinking, what is the connection? Is there a connection, and how this connection can actually be established? And that is actually how I produced this book. But I also produced it thanks to a lot of authors, a lot of people who actually, before this book, and you will see it later, wrote country studies that actually fed my empirical analysis. And for today, I want to thank Professor Jason Buhai from Baylor University in the US, who actually wrote a country study on China, to which I will be referring in my results as well. I will mention it a little bit later. And now back to the common features. What I asked myself along the way, as I said, was whether there were some indeed connections, and I came up, as I said, with intermediary levels of government. I came up that with the fact that in all of these systems there are differential responses to identity differences. And I also I desperately tried to find an illustration for this to depict how this actually looks like. I tried to find a better example, but of course, multi-level governance is not something that is very interesting or something that you can make interesting. So unless you're a little bit passionate, like I am, then you stand no chance. But I tried. So imagine that there's a central level, and then imagine that there's a local level, and everything in between is this terrible drawing that I made of subnational entities, substate entities, where the circled ones are the regular ones, and the squared ones would be a differentiated ones. That is how I depicted it for myself. But then again, I knew that it was actually challenging to present those differential responses as consequences of identity. And it was also challenging to measure those responses. What is the extent to what is the length to which they go? So what I tried first, I tried to make a short sketch for myself of all of the multi-level systems. That would be something logical for me, and I came up with this table where I've put multi-level systems with identity differences that would have differential responses, but I realized I needed more structure, and I didn't have that, and I didn't know how to get there, because there was a theoretical argument, for example, from the Forum of Federations that, and I keep repeating this all the time, but humor me for the sake of discussion, that almost half of the world's population now lives in multi-level, in systems that look like multi-level systems, and most of those systems are actually systems that deal with identity differences. So that's quite a lot of people. That is quite a bit of population. But as I said, I was thinking whether the link was the real thing, whether asymmetrical responses were the real thing. That was something to be discovered, and could I actually explain this link, and was I able to prove it? So I went to the statistics department first, and so I came out swinging. I was very confident. I thought I figured it all. And I told them I want to do this, and the first thing they asked me, and I also, for me, it was a very funny story because my reaction was incredibly funny, at least in my terms. The first thing they asked me was, so what are your properties? And for the second, I stood there and I was thinking, why do they need to know about my possessions? Because I don't need to pay for this. University is paying for this. And then I realized, no, this is not what they're asking. And then they saw that there was a terror on my face, and they told me, oh, you're a lawyer. So we need to be cautious with you. We need to introduce you slowly into this. And they did. They just told me they needed to know the characteristics of the systems I wanted to research. So I told them I want my systems to be multi-level, and I want them to to have identity differences. They said, okay, but that is still too broad, and we need sub-properties. So these are the sub-properties I came up with, and then I started. I took the list from the United Nations, and I drew out 36 systems that would fall within the first category, and out of 36, there were 15 with identity differences. And then the second step was to actually draw out the differentiated status or differentiated positioning, I would say, which was according to literature, according to the theoretical framework I made, it was based on 3 indicators, for example, status, powers, and fiscal autonomy. I've discerned it, I've made a number of sub-indicators, and that was then translated into qualified respondents' questionnaires. And those questionnaires were then sent to a number of experts, professors all around the world in those 36 systems. And of course, as I said, one of those was Jason Buhai as well for China. And their task was actually to test the systems for me, because of course I had no knowledge. On that. But I also knew, in order to feed my analysis based on the qualified respondents' questionnaires, I also needed something else. I needed to know more about those systems to understand them. So together with a colleague of mine, we decided to have an edited volume of those 15 systems, in which we had all of the country studies from the 15 systems that I identified as multi-level with identity differences with subnational entities. So that was the beginning. That was the methodological approach and the methodological choice. Of course, I finally made it in terms of collecting all of the data. I had my primary and secondary population, and then what I needed to compare was actually to make the comparison between those multi-level systems that do not have identity differences and those that do have, or to check for the variance. And the variance, as I've learned, is just a fancy term in descriptive statistics that accounts for recorded differences between those 2 types of systems. And of course, within those that were not having identity differences, there was no variance. So there was no differences among the subnational entities, while in those that did have identity differences, there was variance. So for 2 systems, of course, you will see here, for example, for Canada, I did not record the variance because SPSS was, the perimeters were set in that kind of a way. But that doesn't mean they did not exist. It was just that they were limited. So it says none, but also there were other factors that actually implied that there would be differences. Here I also, for your own, because we are now in Hong Kong, or you are mostly in Hong Kong, and I'm here in Antwerp, China is in red only for your own convenience. So what I discovered here, based on the analysis, is that of course, each of the systems has their own specificities, and in some systems, this differential treatment of subnational entities shows in different categories, in all categories. Sometimes it shows only in, sometimes it doesn't show, just like in the case of Canada. But I think the most important part is that under status, we normally see that differentiation between regular, ordinary subnational entities and those which are based on identity differences so in status we see the differences are mild or moderate, while in powers and fiscal autonomy, these tend to be either moderate or strong. So I questioned the reasons for this. So one of the possible explanations that I came up with, also based on the country studies, was actually that maybe the power ratio among distinct groups could have been the reason. Because displaying the counterbalancing ratios might have affected something like that. Moreover, for example, more than a number of systems here actually have more than 10 or more distinct groups that sometimes territorially embed, sometimes not, such as China, for example, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and so on. Also, some of those systems, such as China and Russia, do display centralizing and integrative processes. In China and Russia, this is very strenuous thing. While, for example, in Italy or Pakistan or Malaysia, it is gentler. I think it is more gentle than in those two systems. So it seems also that the centripetal processes here are usually linked to the status of subnational entities. To my mind, this was because the status is the most observable feature. It seems that suppressing this feature creates the image of uniformity. It creates the image of interconnectedness within the system. And then again, it is also possible that, for example, subnational entities do insist, for example, or do insist more on powers, on fiscal autonomy, because, for example, powers in terms of language or culture are more important than, for example, status, or preserving resources through taxing or spending powers might be more important than the status. So this was the logic. This was the logic that I came up with. When it comes to, for example, powers and competences, as I said, it was kind of correlating to what I had in mind, that especially specific types of powers and competences, because I had it as my sub-indicators, that, for example, culture and religion and education that is granted, for example, to subnational entities actually gives more to subnational entities than status. And sometimes this seemed to be even connected to bilaterally negotiated status. It was sometimes connected to colonial powers, just like, for example, with Hong Kong and Macau in China. When it comes to financial autonomy or fiscal autonomy, the most prominent asymmetry, we see that it is normally moderate or strong, but the most prominent is normally under power to raise taxes. It is most prominent under the revenues. Of course, this tends to be mostly related, that was in my mind, to the subnational entities that are wealthy, those that have resource-rich those that are resource-rich subnational entities, like, for example, Kurdistan in Iraq, for example, and maybe even Hong Kong in China, or Flanders, for example, in Belgium. And that actually implied that I needed to do something else, because here, what we knew was that by now I knew that identity differences do link to multi-level governance in specific types of systems, in fragmenting systems mostly. But identity differences itself alone could not definitely explain constitutional asymmetries or differentiated positioning within the system on their own merits. So then I decided, on the basis of what I just said, on the basis of thinking about power ratio or vertical power management related to democratic or less democratic regimes, related to wealth, related to historical reasons, or maybe even separatist claims, I decided that maybe I should do another analysis. And that is where the QCA analysis kicks in. And that is a data analysis technique for determining which logical conclusions a data set supports. So this was another type of software, although very rudimentary software that was ready to use. So in this case, I could dissect here which conditions most often appear to be somehow related to differential positioning of subnational entities. So to test my assumptions that I just mentioned, as I said, the software was ready, and I tested them against the indicators that I mentioned, against status, against powers and competences, and against fiscal autonomy. And then what I've confirmed here is that, for example, that the absence of strong central level or one-party dominance goes along with differential positioning. It goes along with constitutional asymmetries. Only when this condition is missing from this recipe, then we see that systems such as China, for example, appear, because China, as I said, displays integrative forces and supports unification. I've also confirmed that there are some historical reasons that seem to be very prominent contributor to differential positioning. So here I had several examples, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina with Dayton Peace Agreement, China with separate bilateral negotiations between the Chinese government and colonial powers over the Hong Kong and Macau. There was India with the accession of Jammu and Kashmir. There was Iraq with the new constitution and so on. And then also I looked into wealth, because wealth came out also to confirm my assumption as it emerged as a decisive congruent feature as well. And it seemed that it was linked to per capita wealth, for example, in Kurdistan region, but also the country studies implied that, for example, Hong Kong and Macau also might have had a connection here. But in some cases, for example, in the United Kingdom, we saw that wider fiscal powers, for example, in Scotland, could also have the connection here. And then I think also what I've also confirmed through this analysis is that if there was the absence of vertical power management, sort of to say, as I said, it goes perfectly with if there's the absence of vertical power management, there we see more differential positioning. If we would further minimize the results from the QCA, then we would see that first, the congruence of some historical reasons, separatist claims, is one of the most obvious suspects for differential positioning. And then also we would see that there would be also an unbalanced power ratio that would maybe coincide with those historical reasons. But then on the other side, if there would be vertical power management, especially if it would be combined with separatist movements, that could also produce this kind of outcome. What I wanted to say, I would like to wrap up at least for here, because it's getting more complex. I think in the outcome, the analysis confirmed actually that the absence of vertical power management allows for more freedom, for differential positioning, for more constitutional asymmetry. And as I said, some examples do confirm this. And importantly, wealth seems to be a decisive factor for gaining this type of positioning. And it has been seen in many cases in this analysis. And then interestingly enough, historical reasons that are sometimes quite often combined with separatist claims actually emerged as a new factor in gaining and maintaining this specific status. One observation from my analysis was that was the way how identity differences actually interact with differential positioning. Sometimes they reinforce, but sometimes they are reinforced. So it really depends on what type of systems are we talking about. So if we're talking about holding together systems, fragmenting systems, such as, for example, Bosnia and Herzegovina, such as Belgium, such as Spain, Iraq, and so on, then we see that identity differences are reinforced by those factors, by those congruent features. But then if we talk about coming together systems, where we would put Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on, the pattern would be that identity differences reinforce those factors. Such as, for example, the colonial reshuffling of territories, conflict, separatist threats, and so on. But then two systems actually stood out from the analysis, and those are China and Russia, because they are neither holding together or coming together anymore, but there's, as I said, a presence of very strong vertical power management or micromanagement even. And it seems that identity differences in China, or at least that came out from the country studies, and we can talk about it later. I would like to also have feedback, is reinforced by economic aspects in SARS. But at the same time, it reinforces, for example, the establishment of EMARs. So yeah, but in Russia, it's at the same time, it's reinforced and reinforces the historical reasons for the distinctive position. And so, yeah, that was the first part. But then the question was how all of this actually affects legitimacy, how all of this affects stability of those systems. So what is the deal here? How do we go by then? Well, in the first place, I think it is important to say that for a system to be legitimate, and this is now more content related, I think, to the book, for the system to be legitimate, it has to be established in a way to acknowledge the legitimacy of all of these elements. So it has to be linked to a specific group, it has to be linked to a specific territory, level of government, and so on, but it also has to enable all of those actors to interact among and between each other, horizontally, vertically, in their search for the appropriate accommodation of their interests. And since this implies constant modifications of the system in order to fine-tune the accommodation of those diverse particular interests, legitimate multi-level systems that are burdened with identity differences that also, of course, appear to have constitutional asymmetries or differential positioning, they also have to display that different actors accept that type of dynamics. So the question is then how to position the concept of legitimacy to achieve and maintain this broad acceptance and support. So the challenge is to enable mutual horizontal checks among subnational entities, as well as multiple vertical checks. but also the checks between citizens, groups, levels of government. And so, yeah, what we need to take into consideration here is that there are many-sided and mutual relationships, that there are many intermediated processes, that there is a combination of input, output, and throughput legitimacy, that we need to take into consideration the principles of representation, participation, responsiveness, the quality of governance processes, accountability as well, that are surfacing also from the indicators that I mentioned previously. And I do not have that much time to present them all, but also the overarching principles that are based on all of this, at least through my analysis, came down to equality and transparency. Because, for example, representation, participation, responsiveness, accountability, quality of governance processes seemed to be operationalized, at least in those systems that I researched, through equality and transparency. And we see that in most systems, we do have drawbacks in terms of legitimacy, in terms of all of these things that I mentioned previously. But then what we saw in China is a little bit different. China takes a different turn. Because despite the fact, of course, that came out from the analysis, from the analysis that I've done, but also from the country study that was done by Jason Buhai. So it seemed that despite the fact that the Chinese constitution vests all power in the people, the participation at the central level is actually designed in such a way to depend on the party state. And so the participation of diverse groups actually depends on their political loyalty, depends, and sometimes, well, more often than not, it is imposed. And for example, since 2000, it seemed that the central level government imposed a number of coercive measures to keep the protests, for example, in Tibet, under close scrutiny of the party state, and especially after in Hong Kong, especially after it tried to define universal suffrage and pre-approved candidates on their list. So what this implies is actually the lack of inclusive ties between and among not only territorial entities, but also societal factors within the society, within the system of government, and among and between the citizens groups. But it also questions the equality of the actors that are participating in the system of government. And so the vertical power building that we see in China and Russia, as I said, because those two systems stand out, influences transparency in this regard, although in a different way than in other countries. Because, as I said, the system is based on the party state, and therefore the channels, for example, for cooperation, for communication, are not always evident. Since, for example, institutional changes and decision-making dynamics are determined by the party. And then transparency is unchecked. And if transparency is unchecked, then we have problems with openness, responsiveness, and accountability, which are actually then compromised. And then also what we learned from the country studies is that in China, due to the voting pattern that favors a party, no group has a power of veto as well to the constitutional amendment processes. And so, yeah, this creates or generates this environment in which debatable matters are not debatable or are discouraged from debating. In terms of fiscal matters, and this part, I would say, the party state in China also maintains a tight fiscal discipline, not only by through oversight, but also by appointing the administrators that are supported in a vague presentation of fiscal matters. And this also implies lack of inclusiveness, but also the aspects of blurring accountability as well of actors that are involved in fiscal matters. For example, even though transfers are determined along with fixed criteria in China, it seems that additional funds are granted to less developed provinces. But then again, the central government favors Han populations in the ethnic minority autonomous regions in equalization policies. So yeah, in terms of, as I said, equality and transparency, we do see quite a bit of drawbacks in China, but of course, a little bit different than in other states in analysis. How do we manage stability? How stability is managed in those systems? Well, here I also refer to the concept of dynamic stability, just as well that was established as a previous one, because stability entails holding in check actually all of the centripetal pressures that come from central level of government aiming towards more centralization, unity, symmetry. And so it means preventing centrifugal, but also centripetal pressures from all of the levels. For us, dynamic stability actually means that structural and fiscal imbalances are strongly connected with the questions of mutual respect, common interests, with solidarity, which are essential to the concept of cohesion. I wouldn't call it a principle necessarily, but this connects to several qualities of cohesion, which is adaptiveness, since it requires a constant fine-tuning of common interest and solidarity to maintain, for example, those structural and fiscal balances. Then it's about trust, since mutual respect ensures fair play and predictable expectations in the outcomes of the management of the system. And then, of course, coordination, since it connects tiers of government and groups together in their common interests to balance their status, powers, and fiscal autonomy. Linked to this, it seems that stability actually revolves around counterbalancing the influence of the central level, and we see that when the role of subnational entities is either too weak or too strong, then the balance is shifted. That is logical. In China, this is quite evident, for example, where subnational entities are too weak or too loyal to the party state to do so. We also see that favoring, for example, specific entities, as I just mentioned, may cause distrust as well. But also the strategy of vertical power management also has repercussions for the cohesion, because the aim of the central level might be to impel national identification, but this extreme centralization, which is aimed at neutralizing the differences, goes against social cohesion that accepts diversity along with the national identification. And in response, we've seen that several distinctive subnational entities, such as Hong Kong, such as Tibet, have often displayed dissatisfaction. And of course, we've seen this also in Pakistan. We've seen this in other countries as well. Some examples we see also on this slide, just for your own reference. I'm not going to go into the details of this. We may discuss it during the Q&A, but I would like to finish with this because I think I've spoken long enough. And of course, there are people who know how to finish their presentation, people, of course, who say that's it. Normally, I'm this person who says that's it, but now the university has done it very easy for me because they've just gave us this slide with the disclaimer. So yeah, here's the disclaimer. I'll accept the questions gladly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maja. You covered a lot of ground, but it was very clear and very informative. So really very grateful to you for that presentation. We'll now move on to the Q&A. I've received one question in the chat, and I have some questions of my own. Maybe I'll give you to start one question for me and then a question from my colleague Ryan Mitchell that I just got in the chat. So the question for me is, I didn't fully understand what is meant by differential responses to identity issues. So I think I took it. I think what it means is, so, if there's a region that has a different language or a different culture, they're allowed to practice that religion or culture in a way that's different from other places. Or is it, so I think that's what it is, but it seems like there's another aspect to it, which is it the case that in some of these countries that you mentioned, that there's also a difference in the amount of central government control over just those subnational units that have identity differences, right? So is that the asymmetry there? Is that the difference? Or is it just the fact that they're allowed to do separate things? So I wasn't quite sure if it's both of those things or one of those things. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then let me give you my colleague Ryan Mitchell's question. It says, regarding the comparison of levels of autonomy, is it necessary to look beyond constitutional structure per se? For example, in the Chinese case, nationwide education and cultural policies can result in major intrusions into local society and governance. These sort of factors may not be captured by looking strictly at formally defined competence of state organs. So basically, do you have to look kind of beyond sort of what's on paper, right, in the structure into something deeper? So why don't we start there? Those two questions.
Let me just, so that I do not forget what the question was. Yeah, indeed, you're right, Rihan. It is differential responses are actually constitutional asymmetries, and constitutional asymmetries are differences in status, powers, and fiscal autonomy. To put it in more, let's say, parsimonious way, they are based on political asymmetries. So they're based on differences in population, in the size of territory, differences in identity, for example, and those political asymmetries, they exist regardless, so independently from those constitutional asymmetries. But once, when there is enough political mobilization to embed those differences in the constitutional or whatever constitution is in a specific country, once when they're constitutionally embedded, they become constitutional asymmetries, and indeed they give those national entities specific positioning within the system, and that is what we see. For example, in terms of the Basque Country, specific positioning in terms of taxes, policing, for example, we see that, for example, in Wales, in the United Kingdom, in terms of use of language, in Scotland, in terms of, for example, the application of the actually legal system, because the common law, they use civil law. So that kind of puts them in a position in the sense in the UK is precluded, or Quebec in Canada, for example, as well, which also puts Quebec in terms of, for example, the number of Constitutional Court judges is much higher than in terms of proportion, sort of to say. We also see it in Indonesia, where specific subnational entities, for example, apply Islamic law, unlike others. So anything regarding the status or powers or competences can actually mean that there are this type of differences. The case is that among those, as you rightly suggested, it is the case that that there is also the difference in how the central government influences this dynamic. So there are centripetal and centrifugal forces always in those systems. And we see that, as I said, in China and Russia, this is quite forceful in terms of steering, central level steering. In some systems, we see less forceful symmetrization processes, like in Italy, where the Constitutional Court, for example, tried to symmetrize the relationships between special and ordinary regions, special, especially in terms of the South Tyrol, which has very wide autonomy, sort of to say. So yeah, we see the difference also there, but these are not, as I said, the only differences. We see the differences in, for example, in veto powers, we see differences in of subnational entities. We see the differences in opting in, opting out mechanisms. We see differences in power sharing in general. We see differences in which powers have been assigned to specific subnational entities, and also, yeah, as I said, budgetary control and so on, transfers, fiscal transfers, not only taxing, as I said. In terms of, I hope this answers your question. I hope I understood it correctly. And then in terms of whether we need to look beyond the constitutional text and because some factors may not be captured, yes, indeed, we do need to do that. I did try, I was aware that doing empirical research as a lawyer is that I needed to embrace, and that also meant not being nervous about leaving out possibly some details that might seem to me as a lawyer important, but as someone who would do, I don't know, social science experiments and so on, might not at that point be that important. That is why I did the country studies, where I asked the experts to write the country studies in a very specific way, where I created a form. And then in this form, I asked them to do specific, to answer to the specific questions of which I required them to address, but I also left enough space for all of them to write down whatever they thought was important and something that I have not thought of. That was also the case with the qualified respondents questionnaires. They were closed-ended questionnaires because obviously I did the descriptive statistics analysis, but I've also left the comments section just in case there would be something, and I did receive some comments as well. But yeah, going beyond the constitutional text and constitutional structure, that should be done. Whether my approach was too institutional, yes, I would agree. But then again, what is the other way? What is the other way? Because I also had this discussion with a colleague of mine, Carlo Basta, who also wrote a book on something similar, but from a very different aspect. And then the discussion was whether we actually have the other way of approaching those issues that are not institutional, and what that approach would actually entail. So yeah, I hope this answers the question. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we probably only have time for one more question, so I'll read another one from the chat. It's a good broad question, I think, to end on. So it says, what trends in the development of multi-level governance have you seen over the past several decades? Are central authorities growing or decreasing in strength globally? And do well-designed systems of multi-level governance seem to be increasing in strength or coming under strain?
Mm-hmm. Well, normally when I talk about multi-level governance, I Well, I'm a federal scholar. I think the main difference between how we used to see the multi-level governance and how we see it today. And I think we see more and more decentralizing features, and I'll tell you why. Because traditionally we would subscribe to the definition of systems to unitary, federal, and confederal. Confederal do not really exist anymore. Federal systems were just the second good choice after the unitary systems, and they were always made in such way, or they were organized in such a way so they are so that they have a unifying factor, so that they have symmetrizing features, and more often than not, if there would be some identity differences, what we saw traditionally in systems that we call model federations, such as the United States, Germany, even Austria, and so on, we would also see that any type of identity differences that would counteract the overarching identity of being American or German, and so on, would be counterbalanced, and they were not welcome, sort of to say. What we see in the past few decades is that more and more we see fragmenting systems, such as Belgium, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, such as Myanmar, such as systems that were even coming together systems are now becoming fragmenting systems. And this is all the consequence of identity. And yes, of course, we see more and more decentralizing features. Also, there's a lot of gray area in multi-level governance in terms of not having simply unitary and federal or that sort of dichotomy, but we see that between unitary and possibly confederal, there are federal principles that we can apply to any type of system, starting, for example, with Italy or the UK or Spain, which are not necessarily federal systems, but do display federal principles. So what we see is that we see a lot of decentralizing forces. We do see that the central government is trying hard to keep all of this in check. We see that, of course, we saw it when the independence referendum in Spain happened. As I said, we saw it through in Italy, also through the symmetrization processes. But at the same time, I do believe that those, or at least that's from what my research looks like, that fragmenting forces, or those, that the balance between centrifugal and centripetal is not really the balance. So it goes towards the subnational entities who are actually pushing towards their way toward more devolution or decentralization, whatever you want to call it. So that would be the trend, I think, that we see. But I would be lying if I would be saying that there were no centralizing or symmetrization practices involved. As I said, we've seen it as well.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Maja. That brings an end to this talk. Thanks again for this terrific seminar. Thanks to everyone for questions and for attending.